Oh,
Matt,
for you.
welcome. We're
Sorry for being
just
just in time.
right. We're just waiting for folks to sign on. Okay, good morning, everyone. Romano from the Progressive Policy Institute, and we'd like to welcome you to the webinar today on learners and workers face a changing skills landscape. The agenda for this morning is we'll spend the first 15, 20 minutes or so with Matt Siegelman from the Burning Glass Institute, and I'll introduce Matt in a second, and then go to a panel that will be led by Carrie McKettrick, who is the co-director of the Harvard Project on Workforce, and she'll introduce the panelists then. They'll have a conversation about some of the things that we talked about in the prior conversation with Matt, and at the end of that, probably bring Matt in to also have a sort of give and take with the panelists, and then open it up to questions from the audience at the end. So you can put questions in the chat function, and we'll pick those up as we go along. Let's give folks maybe another 30 seconds or so to sign on here so that we have folks here. Okay, let me do a brief intro to Matt, and then we'll begin our conversation. Matt's president of the Burning Glass Institute, and I'll ask him in a minute or so to give us a little bit more background on the Institute. Matt and his team have created a field of real-time labor market data, and they track demand for tens of thousands of skills across over 30 countries. And a lot of that research that they've done we'll talk about over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, though we'll focus on three primary reports that Burning Glass has put out. The first one entitled Launchpad Jobs, Achieving Career and Economic Success Without a Degree. The second one is called the American Opportunity Index, and the other one is about how Gen AI could change the value of expertise and how it relates to a couple of the topics that we would have talked about in the other reports. So Matt, welcome, and why don't you spend a couple of minutes, a minute or so, telling folks about the Burning Glass Institute so they have a better sense of the organization and the kind of work that it does.
Well, Bruno, thank you so much for the chance to join you today. I've been so looking forward to this conversation. So the Burning Glass Institute is something that we started a little over 3 years ago now as a nonprofit data lab, which is leveraging in a broad array of data sets in order to be able to understand what's working in building economic mobility, in growing community prosperity, in boosting workforce equity, and in enhancing outcomes for learners and workers. We live at a time of tremendous wealth when it comes to data resources. As many may know, I spent 20 years building a company which is now called Lightcast, which has been providing very powerful data about the landscape of opportunity for workers and learners, and for employers, the landscape of talent. The work of the Institute, which is fully independent, is to be able to take data sets like that, but many others out there today, and say, what do they tell us, and how can we use them to actually solve real problems and improve outcomes? So we're getting to work on, well, on the one hand, we do a lot of research, and I'm looking forward to chatting about some of that research, because it highlights where some of the problems are. It frames where some potential solutions may lie. But much more of our work is on the ground, working with partners to be able to leverage data in ways that boosts opportunity and success.
The topic today is learners and workers face a changing skills landscape. So let's start with the end of that title, the changing skills landscape. What do you mean by that? And what does the changing skills landscape look like?
So, first of all, I'm glad we're talking about it in the word skills, because I think we tend to get hung up on the vocabulary of jobs instead. We hear a lot of warranted apprehension about the potential for jobs to go away. We hear futurists talking about all the new jobs that are going to be born. There's some of that that's going on, and certainly we live in a dynamic job market. But the substrate of the market, the genome of the labor market, is actually skills. Skills define jobs. Skills define the distance between talent and opportunity, and skills define the dynamism of the market. So much more than jobs going away, what we can see already is that the skills that are required to do a job change very fast. We found in a study we did together with partners at BCG 2 years ago that the average US job has seen 37% of its top skills replaced just in the prior 5 years. Now, think about that number 37% for a second, because it sounds big, but then think about, like, hey, has 37% of the curriculum of your typical community college changed in 5 years, or the learning and development catalog of a corporate learning platform changed? And the answer is, of course not. I mean, actually, the community college would have to go for an accreditation review if they change more than a few percent of their curriculum. We have the implications of this. And by the way, that was analysis that we did before the advent of generative AI, which has only accelerated things. The implication of this is, on the one hand, the workforce that we have may not be the workforce that we need. And conversely, also for workers, what it means is that you may not be qualified to be able to land a job in the field that you've been working in for many years, if you were forced to change jobs. Now think about where we are as an economy, with so much potential for softening over the months ahead. I'll not get into to comment on recent events, but I think we can all sort of anticipate that there may in fact be good levels of displacement. One of the things we've learned in the past is that where people really suffer, jobs change, jobs have always changed over time. The problem is not that your employer wakes up and says, okay, you're no longer qualified for this job. It's more likely that you lose your job for whatever kind of macroeconomic reasons, and can't get another in your field because there's skills that have evolved in the field and that you haven't.
You made passing reference to, I'll call it, the disconnect between the kind of skills landscape that you describe and the traditional way these traditional institutions, the community colleges, the four-year institutions work at preparing people for the workforce. I know you also did an analysis, I think it was in cooperation with Excel and Ed that looked at states and the disconnect between the kinds of requirements that states are having when it comes to some of the CTE work they do and other things like that, the disconnect between that and the sort of skills marketplace that you described. Maybe talk about that a little bit more, the disconnect between these two.
I think this is a really big problem right now, and it's this. We have a what nerds like myself would call a signal processing problem in the market. It's not that we lack for signals. Employers every day send out post up millions of job ads that say what they're looking for. We know that workers are sending out millions of resumes every day that are talking about their qualifications, but we wind up with lack of a common language. And that makes it very hard for either of those, but also for the educators and training providers who are and public officials whose job it is to try to bridge between them to really be able to understand where there's need and where there's talent and how and what gaps need to be bridged. The impacts of that in the report that you're mentioning is some work that we did, as you said, with Excel and Ed, looking specifically at CTE programs. There's been rightly as a lot of and growing focus on CTE as a way of preparing students in high school to make effective transitions into work, recognizing that most high school students either don't go to college right away or go to college and don't complete or complete and don't actually wind up in a college level job. So all that says we need to be paying more attention on that to preparing students in high school. But again, because there's no meaningful signals that CTE administrators can read, what we looked at is what are the credentials that CTE systems are, state CTE systems are helping students acquire. As many may know, career and technical education systems are required by the Perkins Act to make sure that people can acquire credentials that are industry recognized. But that's a pretty open definition, and as a result, high school is getting a lot of high school officials are getting a lot of information from a lot of different sources that aren't necessarily helpful. And so you have what we found is that only 18% of credentials earned through CTE systems are actually in demand for good jobs. Meanwhile, lots of jobs that could be accessible to high school graduates going undersupplied. We see the same thing across the credential spectrum. I think many of us are optimistic that we can move to a system that instead of being qualification denominated is skill denominated. For that to work, you need to be able to have effective signals of skills. But what we're finding in some forthcoming research is that, in fact, very few non-degree credentials are leading to meaningful wage gains. And unless we've got those signals, educators continue to prepare students for careers that may not be great careers. Last year, there were 7,000 students nationwide who were in the National Pork Council's Safe Pork Handling certification.
That moves us into, I think, the first report we should spend a few minutes on, the one on Launchpad jobs. And the issue you talk about here is, why does it matter where a young person starts? Let me read a quote to you from the report, pages 3 and 5 to be exact. Quote, "The initial job out of high school is the first crucial choice. There is no way for a student to know today that what roles that all seem to start from the same place can end up leading to wildly different economic circumstances later." So maybe spend a few minutes talking a little bit about it matters where you start because you can end up in all different directions and the need for some sort of guidance on that pathway.
So first, just to back up, this analysis that you described is work that we undertook in partnership with ASA. And the goal of it was to be able to actually understand how do people's careers bear out when people make the decision not to go to college. Again, I think many of us believe that I imagine probably most or all of us believe that there should be good economic opportunities available to people that don't require passing through college and out the gates on the other end. And so what we wanted to do is understand empirically what are those paths and what are the paths that actually work. And so we studied the career histories of 7 million people who went straight to work after high school. And what we did is we tracked those people over time, 20 years, and said, what are the paths that seem to provide the most opportunity? So first of all, the good news there was that there's some of those paths are quite predictable, and also that there are many people who go straight to work after high school who are doing really well. The top 20% of people who didn't go on to college are out earning the median college graduate. And so that says it is absolutely possible. And as I said, predictable paths, a lot of it, as you've pointed out, Bruno, it has to do with the first job you have right out the gates. We found there were some sets of first jobs that make you 4 times more likely to be a top earner by the time you're 40. Conversely, there are some sets of jobs that make you also around 4 times more likely to wind up at or near poverty by the time you're 40. And the problem is not only that we don't have the kind of advising that students would need in order to help direct them effectively to the one, to understand which are which and where different jobs lead over time. Not only that, our CT system, as we just discussed a minute or two ago, means that people are acquiring credentials that aren't preparing them for good jobs. But the problem is also that sometimes the good and the bad jobs, these kind of these launch pad jobs and then bad starts, are really hard to tell apart. Sometimes, I'll give you an example. Though none of these is actually a launch pad job. If you were to compare the person who takes a job, graduates high school and takes a job seating people in a restaurant, that person will make about $22,000 a year. The person who graduates high school and takes a job at the back of the restaurant plating food will make actually slightly more, about $23,000 a year. The latter, the person who's in the back of the restaurant, if you track where they go through all the various twists, turns, and tangles in their career over the next 20 years, 20 years out is making in the 30s. So making a little more than that 23 that they started at, but probably still not family sustaining. The person who started out hosting people, seating people at the front, is making almost $70,000 a year. And there's nobody who is telling you, do this, not that.
Let's jump to, I think all of these will come back in the panel discussion and then the sort of interaction that you have with them toward the end of their discussion. So let's raise another issue here, which is not unrelated. You and your colleagues published an article in the Harvard Business Review entitled How Gen AI Could Change the Value of Expertise. And you raise a few issues there, again, about entry-level hires, earning and learning curves, the experience gap. So maybe blend that into the conversation now a little bit. And then we'll end up with the American Opportunity Index, which talks a little bit more about another issue.
So our work with ASA and identifying launchpad jobs is really about how do people make effective starts. And the ability to make a start into a job, of course, depends on how much entry-level opportunity there is. And so we recently, together with our colleagues at the Harvard Business School, Project on Managing the Future of Workforce with Joe Fuller and his colleagues, we worked to really try to model AI's impacts on, as you said, on learning curves. And that sounds kind of abstruse, but here's why it's relevant, because learning curves represent how how we acquire the knowledge that's necessary, the expertise that's necessary to enter into a job, and how we acquire expertise on the job over time. And you can actually see learning curves very clearly in data because they're represented by how much people earn. There's some sets of jobs where there's a body of knowledge you need to get into the job, but there's really not a lot of productivity that's gained over time. Think about a bus driver, not an AI impacted job, but nonetheless, you had to learn you had to get your CDL, you had to learn how to operate a bus. But whether you've been on the job for a week or you've been on the job for 30 years, show up on time, don't crash the bus. And so the productivity doesn't necessarily increase, the skills aren't different. And in a lot of those kinds of jobs, AI can really help facilitate people acquiring the domain expertise and the like that's previously been acquired, and can open a lot more opportunity. And help people get in onto the ladder. The problem is there are a lot of other jobs, and many of these are jobs that offer greater career value, are jobs that have a steeper ramp over time. In some ways, think of it sort of like human development. I know some evolutionary biologists say that one of the things that's remarkable about humans and explains, kind of how advanced our intelligence is supposed to be. I say suppose, but is that we actually mature very slowly. And there's a bunch of jobs where you just kind of have to be on that job for a long time and you get better and better. Think about the difference between somebody who's an entry-level marketing assistant, somebody who's a marketing expert. And those are jobs where essentially, even if it's not meeting the federal definition of a registered apprenticeship, they work in an apprentice kind of way. Now, here's the thing. In a lot of those jobs, when we look at AI impacts, we then say, okay, where do the capabilities of AI overlap the tasks and capabilities that are required at the entry level and for people who are highly experienced. And what we find is that there are very considerable and considerably greater impacts at the entry level. What that says is in a lot of those spaces, we're going to need a lot fewer people at the entry level. And so it raises really important questions around how can people get on the ladder in fields that have good scope for upward mobility. It raises questions for educators about what does it take to train students to start their careers in the middle. It raises questions for employers. Hey, if we no longer need people at the entry level, we no longer need our pyramid-shaped organizations. What does a talent pipeline look like that staffs highly expert people but bypasses the entry level? Those are going to be important societal questions and have significant implications for the vitality of the American dream.
Let's raise one final question as we transition over to the panel. That's the report, American Opportunity in that way here. If we started with this notion that where you start matters, this is in shorthand fashion, where you work matters. So talk a little bit about the American Opportunity Index and the kind of analysis that leads us to consider, and then we'll move over to the panel.
And by the way, one of the places we hope to take it is to say, okay, and at which company do you start matters, and more on that as I talk about the American Opportunity Index and where it's going. So the American Opportunity Index grew out of some past research that we did, again, also in partnership with Harvard Business School with Joe Fuller, and also with our colleagues at the Schultz Family Foundation. And in that past work that we've done with Schultz, and in separate past work we've done with Harvard Business School, we found that of across an array of factors that drive economic mobility, one of the most potent is what company you work for. Put differently, you can have two workers who are in the exact same role at directly competing firms who have entirely different prospects for where they move up. And so the opportunity index is our attempt to measure that. And again, empirically, we have a database that we've built at the Burning Glass Institute, which comprises the career histories of 65 million US workers and a few hundred million worldwide. Now built a parallel British Opportunity Index in partnership with the Economist, and also advising an endeavor in another country. And so what we can actually do is say, okay, take two workers in the same role, and that start working at firms. How does working at one firm versus the other change their trajectory? And what we found is that employers have far more agency than they may think as to how much opportunity they unlock for their workers. We found that top employers promote people 2.5 times faster. We find that top employers on the index pay people more than twice as much for the same work. Take the example of an administrative assistant who makes $82,000 at top quintile employers on the index and makes $34,000 at bottom quintile employers. We find that they are also much more likely to reward their employers by staying. So list goes on. And so what it says is that corporate practice matters, and that there are specific things that employers can do to support their workers in helping them to advance.
And just to conclude this, you name names. This is not just done in an abstract way. I think the numbers are something like you include 395 of America's largest employers, and you studied 500 of the largest companies headquartered in the US. So you kind of name names, and you have a way of then organizing that data and tracking it back to particular companies.
Ultimately, our goal here is in this work, in some of our work that's on our forthcoming Credential Value Index, where we analyze the returns on 23,000 different credentials, and certainly on our work with ASA and the Launchpad Jobs Project. And all of them, our ultimate goal is to be able to create what's essentially a nutrition label that workers and others can look at. Nutrition labels have really changed the game for those of us who pay attention to them. You don't have to pay attention to them. You can still eat the pack of Twinkies, but you can't say you weren't warned. And actually, nutrition labels have gotten a lot easier to use. They no longer really tell you how much riboflavin there is. But in a lot of places, the front of the package tells you just, green, yellow, red, how much saturated fat, how much sodium, how much added sugar is there, how many calories, the core basics that you need to make smart and effective decisions. So, our goal is to make sure that we can actually, first of all, recognize employers who are really doing a lot. Second, give workers themselves the tools to be able to make better informed decisions. One of the things we're doing, by the way, with the Opportunity Index as we advance it is to recognize that different employers can be good for different reasons, and to create essentially different archetypes, if you will, of job quality. We've tended to kind of get stuck in a pretty singular definition of job quality. We say that okay, a job is only a quality job if it pays you well, and offers good benefits. What we're trying to do instead is to say, well, some jobs are good jobs because they offer high wages and stability, but some jobs are good jobs because they give you a way to get on the ladder. Some jobs and the companies who offer them are giving people a way to move up in their careers.
Okay, let's transition over to the panel now. Carrie and panelists, you can come on. Carrie will moderate the panel. She is co-director of the Harvard Project on Workforce, and she'll introduce the rest of the panelists. I understand we were having some problems with the chat function, but I think it's been corrected because I see some things in there. But we'll go 15, 20 minutes with the panel. Toward the end of the panel, I think maybe Matt will come back to be part of the discussion there. And then assuming that the chat function is working, we'll have some questions there to answer. Carrie?
Great, thanks, Bruno. And it looks like if you put your question in the Q&A section, they'll come in and I'll do my best to integrate those throughout and especially in the last 10 minutes. So as Bruno said, I'm co-director of the Project on Workforce at Harvard. I'm joined today by two experts and co-authors of the Launchpad Jobs Report. So Matt started chatting about this. We're going to dig in a little bit into that report and a few of the other topics he mentioned. And then we can't let Matt Siegelman get away so easily. So we'll bring him into the discussion at the end. But I'm joined by Judy Goldstein, the Senior Vice President of Marketing and Communications at American Student Assistance, where she works to help ASA propel the mission to engage K-12 students in career exploration and experimentation. Also joined by Carlos Salerno, the Managing Director of Education Insights at the Burning Glass Institute, where he leads the portfolio of research around the economics of post-secondary training programs. So I'm going to start off. Let's jump right in because we have a lot to talk about. Carlo, I'll start with you, but Judy, please jump in.
Sure.
So, as Matt was saying, the conversation is about skills and the landscape of the labor market is really defined by skills. And in your report, it's called the Launchpad Jobs Report, but you talk about Launchpad skills that can lead to economic mobility. So can you explain, Carlo, what those skills are, why they're important, and perhaps I'll add one more thing to that question, which is Matt talked about signals and how can students signal that they have those skills?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here. As we were digging into this project and we were trying to understand the extent to which we could lever upward mobility, right? You start to think of skills as sort of like the DNA of like all, work and sort of economic advancement, right? They're the smallest denominator at which you can actually build competencies and grow competencies. And so, in the project we found in the report, we obviously identified a number of very technical skills that were very esoteric to some of the more technical trades and some of the more technical jobs that we found as launch pads. But more importantly, there was this sort of durable or these transversal soft skills that really ended up being the core of some of the more valuable skill findings in this report, right? Technical communication, technical reporting, technical writing, conflict management, customer service. These are people skills, right? These are communication skills. These are basic core competencies of being able to take ideas and be able to effectively communicate them to drive action, right? Whether it's helping move a process along, whether it's helping to unblock a process that's stuck, or whether it's helping to resolve conflict or just make things happen. These are key core components of things we do on a daily basis across our lives anyway, but take on increased value in the workplace. And so what we found is over and over, these skills kept cropping up. And to Matt's point earlier, as he was talking about, they become extremely valuable in charting career trajectories, right? As we move and become more facile with with a role and we move into management and supervisory positions, which tends to be one of the ways that we do find economic advancement, management and supervisory experience oftentimes is based around people skills and managerial skills and task management skills. These very soft skills that we find to be at the core also turn out to be the very things that can help people propel a job from becoming a technical expert in something to becoming a manager of technical experts of something, if that makes any sense.
Great. And let's go with this durable skills for a second. And for folks who aren't familiar with the term, it's sort of what the field is starting to use and for what's historically called soft skills, communication, problem solving, as Carla was saying. So I think we know, our current system really isn't set up or hasn't historically been set up to teach these skills in the classroom. And we don't actually quite know really how to evaluate them either. I would say there's not a huge consensus about that. So, Judy, what should we be doing? What should educators be doing? Others inside and outside of the classroom to equip students with these skills so that they can be successful?
Yeah, Carrie, thank you for having me, and hi, everyone. It's interesting that you say that schools aren't equipped to teach these skills. They actually are. So if you think about those project-based learning opportunities, kids are learning leadership, communication, collaboration, core skills. If they go into an employer-led challenge like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce does with its pilot on EPIC, they're learning the same thing. And they're also learning presentation skills and other important skills that we call them soft. America Succeeds actually coined the phrase durable skills, and 70% of all job postings, and I think they looked at 82 million job postings, actually list durable skills as a requirement. So teachers are doing this. They're doing it through the project-based learning. They're doing it through competency-based learning. They're doing it through these employer-led challenges. Kids are also learning, this is crazy, but they're also learning these skills when they're gaming. They're learning about leadership. How do I get, whatever the troll is to march down the path? They're learning collaboration. How do I get others to work with me to be able to clobber whoever I'm trying to clobber? And then lastly, if a kid has the opportunity, and we hope that every kid in America has this opportunity to have a work-based learning experience, they are gaining those much needed skills, either as part of the classroom or after the classroom or beyond the classroom. I think the issue is the articulation of skills, and this is what Matt was getting at when he was talking about signals. It's hard enough for us as adults to list something at the top of our resume, right? You've got, a block at the top of your resume with 50,000 skills. Think about a high school kid. They don't use the same terminology that we or employers use. Collaboration, what do they call that? I don't know what they call it, vibing. So we have to figure out a system that allows a young person to recognize the skills that they've gained through these experiences and articulate them to employers or even, to, anyone else that might be seeking to hire. That's the critical thing, and that can be done a couple of different ways. We as adults have to learn teen speak and figure out how to universally micro badge these experiences, and we need to be able to have employers understand what that teen speak is.
I
Carrie?
love that you brought up. Yeah, please go.
Oh, no, one thing I was going to add on to what Judy said is, the challenge, I think, especially for this generation as well, too, is figuring out how to get them to think beyond the job and think about the skills. And let me offer you an example of, I know a student who was a front desk worker at a Hilton and who saw the job as front desk worker at a Hilton as an entry-level, not very interesting role until it was re-articulated to them that, hey, you have an understanding of corporate practice. You have an understanding of high pressure environments. You're able to work and solve customer conflict issues. You have a wide range of highly desirable skills that translate really well into progressively better and more enriching upward economic opportunities. They hadn't been thinking about it that like. They just saw front desk clerk at a hotel, right? And it didn't feel the same way that it felt until they were able to unpack the skills that came with underneath it. And suddenly they realized, hey, I have a lot here that I just didn't realize that I could lean on. And I think, again, it's a messaging problem more than anything else. It's a way to help translate what a job actually means in terms of skills for a generation that's looking in smaller bite-sized increments.
Great. I love that you brought that up. And Judy, I want to continue on this conversation about work-based learning and project-based learning because I think we know, this is one of the most powerful tools. The evidence shows us, high quality internships, apprenticeships really lead to economic mobility. And Carlo, you and I were on a panel actually a few months ago talking about this exact topic. So I'm going to throw it back to you here. I think we talked about why it's important in terms of work-based learning, developing these durable skills, but we also know that there's a shortage of opportunities, right? Particularly opportunities in the workplace that are paid, that are equitable. So, can you talk a little bit about what we can do to build more opportunities, to scale them equitably, and to connect students to these opportunities?
Yes, again, I think, Carrie, we both agree that internships, I mean, probably everybody in this room agrees that internships are probably one of the most effective flywheels for launching successful careers. We have great evidence to show that they propel graduates rapidly into good roles. And if you come from the college educated ranks, they propel you into college level work as well, too, which is really important if you're going to make the investment in a college level degree. Right. But there's a lot we don't know about this space, right? We don't know where internships sit. They're all over the place. They have different names. They start at different times. They cluster in different geographies in different ways. One of the things that we're doing these days is really trying to unpack this landscape and better understand this landscape. Because I think there's a lot of information gaps out there. Like employers and internship willing students, would love to both find one another. And I think there's still just a lot of noise and slack in the system. So figuring out how to help them identify and match to opportunities is probably the first and best step. Remote opportunities are probably also untapped as well from the standpoint of being able to help more rural students and those not in some of the denser coastal or larger metropolitan centers be able to tap these opportunities as well. But most importantly, I think the biggest challenge to boosting equitable internship access is really cracking the code on what do businesses need to help make this be an enhancing solution, right? Bringing people on short term for short stints with very, limited skill sets at the start can feel challenging, but it doesn't feel insurmountable, right? We should be looking at questions around the extent to which internships look like entry-level roles and asking ourselves, how does that create opportunity for businesses? How could internships solve the problem of sticky hiring practices and help build, again, less friction-filled employment experiences, right? We want people, employers want to hire and they want to keep and train. People want to find jobs and they want to stay, right? Figuring out how to solve those together is one of the things that I think internships can do well. And it's one of the things that we are still learning about what the best practices are.
And if I can jump in, Carrie, if you don't mind. So ASA has been working on this for quite a few years. And in 2018, we found out that there were about 30% of employers were offering internships to young people, and that's increased last year, 5 years later, to 38%. In our mind, that's not good enough. But I think what we need to do, we all know that there's lots of barriers for both young people and for employers to be able to connect. So on the young person side, it is transportation, it is time because they have a full work schedule at school. They might also be working in a job, a paid job, and not all paid internships are available. On the employer side, there's just time management, there's insurance, you name it. But I think we have to have the industry think differently about what a work-based learning experience is. It doesn't have to be the 6-week, 2-month, 3-month on-site internship. Carlo mentioned virtual internships. I'm going to push a little bit further. If you imagine a company has 10 things on their list to do, they can get to 8 of them. Why not formulate a process where the last 2 on your list is actually given to a team of kids to try to solve for? We've seen this very successfully done with the CAPS network, which has locations throughout the US, and also the US Chamber of Commerce Foundation. They act as the intermediary. They take off the pressure for the employer and the school to do the underlying foundation. They connect the two. The employer says, here's our challenge. The kids go off and do the challenge. They come back and present solutions. And by the way, the solutions are incredible. Who knew high school kids had the thought and could put together a program that would solve an employer's problem? The reality is they can, and we should be tapping into them. It's good for the employer and it's good for the young person and for the educator.
That's so great. And I love to hear the examples of folks who are doing this well and stepping into this space. And one other I'll throw out is Ripen, which is kind
Oh,
of a
yes.
platform that's trying to kind of bridge that gap between the employer and the college and build sort of regional ecosystems. I'll just throw that out there as well. I know there are many more
There's
folks
many
doing great
more.
work in this space,
Yeah,
many
and
more.
Ripen and others
Um,
are trying to also bring it down to high school kids because these
exactly.
experiences are critical, even middle school kids, for them to get that learn to work experience.
Okay, so I want to get to one more question before we bring that back. And Judy, I'm going to jump right back to you just because of
Sure.
all of the work you're doing in career navigation, career exploration. Because, we heard the first job is crucial, but the company is crucial. The school or the major you choose is all crucial, but there's so much information. It's a complex landscape. And most students don't have much information or guidance to make decisions for their futures. Matt talked a little bit about how career coaching can be a great opportunity. We have a shortage of coaches right now. So I want to, pose to you this question of what do we need to do to make sure students and their families can navigate this really complex landscape and have the information they need to make smart decisions for them?
Yeah, it's such a multifaceted question that deserves a multifaceted answer, so I'll try to be concise. First and foremost, most of our high school guidance are incentivized on the number of kids that matriculate to a 2 or 4 year school. We have to change that perception, and that's done through thought leadership and advocacy and policy. We have to also provide them with the information. They have the desire, but we have to provide them with the information on how to counsel kids if a child has already made the decision with their parents that a 2 and 4 year degree isn't right for them right now. We have to give the guidance, the information on how to find, vet, evaluate, and fund non-degree credentials, short-term credentials, if you will. On the learner side, there is still the perception that if I don't go to college, and as a parent, think about this, if my kid doesn't go to college, what is your kid doing this fall? There still is the perception that I'm a bad parent if my kid doesn't go on to get a college degree. So we need to change that perception. And ASA with Jobs for the Future last year announced a multi-million-dollar initiative to tackle just that, to create a narrative shift campaign to help people think differently, and also ultimately to create a resource for students, for their parents, for employers, and for practitioners to get together to be able to understand what is a high quality credential, how do I find it, how do I evaluate it, and once I've done that, how do I talk about it, how do I fund it, and how do I access it? And hopefully this fall we'll come out with our first MVP and we'll launch a product which will include the ability to connect for work-based learning opportunities in 2026.
Carrie, can I add one thing quickly onto
Please
that?
do.
I am Judy's biggest fan around all of this because I've had the opportunity to work with Judy on this project. And so we know we think alike on this. Look, I mean, counselors are strapped. It's really hard for high school counselors, especially to guide students. They're working under extreme ratios. They're to Judy's point, is good guidance is well needed, but tactically delivered is really important. To Matt's point at the beginning of the webinar, there are a lot of jobs for 17 to 21-year-olds that all start out in roughly the same pay band, all look roughly the same way. And it's really hard to figure out which one of those could lead to amazing opportunities later and which ones may stall and peter out earlier. Myth busting is important here, right? Being able to help folks understand which jobs can propel is critical. But the bigger thing, I think, and I think Judy not only hit on it, but I think is leading the charge here, is When we do a report like Launchpad Jobs and we do this very complicated analysis and we study all these jobs and these career trajectories, that's great for the research and policymaking community. It needs to be translated to the 17-year-old to 21-year-old community. Our children, sit on smartphones and they look at and consume information in completely different ways. They're not looking at dashboards. They're not looking at they're not looking at wage curves. We need to figure out how to communicate these things to the people that we want to eventually make decisions off of it. And that oftentimes looks very different. And figuring out how to crack that nut and figuring out how to take complicated, really good analysis and turn it into a practical consumer tool is what I think is the biggest needle mover eventually.
Yeah, and it's
That's a
not
great.
just KSA and JFF where we've identified, 300 partners who could possibly add some sort of activities or some sort of experience. So what we're hoping to build is a digital first tool predominantly for learners in a game-like setting where they can access on the phone, and that we're serving up bite-sized pieces of content in the way that they want to consume it. So not the way an adult
That's
would
great.
consume it, but the way a 16 or an 18 or a 21-year-old would consume it.
That's great. And I wasn't, I can't help but say that we released a report today
Yeah.
about where, folks get information. Family and friends are the one and two sources of career information. And so I think we need to understand how to tap into those networks as you're talking about tailor our communication to kids. Okay, Matt, please come back because I never miss a chance to chat with you. I have to say, Matt is one of our senior advisors at the Project M Workforce. We are very lucky to have him. So, Matt, we're talking about, providing the information for students to choose a first job and getting the skills. But as you were saying, this labor market is changing rapidly. The landscape of entry-level jobs is changing. So, what should students, what should their families, what should educators be thinking about to prepare them for this rapidly changing marketplace?
So first, I want to go back to something that Carlo was talking about before, and that's about making sure that we're building on a good foundation. Together with ASA, a couple of years ago, we looked at what are the foundational skills for the 21st century economy for sort of the high value jobs in today's market. And we found, when you look across all of those jobs, there are certain sets of skills that they all demand. And what was interesting about it is we're used to thinking about foundational skills as just being sort of air quotes soft skills. It's not a label I love. Those kind of core skills that are at the bedrock of America's liberal arts heritage. And we certainly found very strong demand across careers for those kinds of skills. But we also found significant need across careers for digital skills, for data skills, for coding skills, even for business skills, project management, as just one example of a business skill. You may not think like, hey, why do I need a project manager? Does everybody really need business skills? But, project management is something you're going to need whether you're going into tech, whether you're going into construction, whether you're going to become a nurse who has to manage care across providers. And so there certainly are a set of foundational skills I would say are really important. So that'd be the first thing. And by the way, Carrie, I mean, this also sort of echoes our colleague David Deming's work, where David, for those who don't know him, is an incredible economist at Harvard and one of the founders of the Project in the Workforce. And his work has shown that the kinds of jobs that are growing the fastest are the jobs that blend what he calls math skills and social skills. And so that really is going to be an especially important lesson in age of AI. AI can automate specific tasks and functions, but what it will also do is not it doesn't actually it doesn't automate all of the capabilities. What it's going to do is instead democratize a lot of those capabilities. So I keep hearing people telling me, oh, well, why study coding? Why study data science in an age of AI? And actually, precisely because we're entering an age of AI, is why everyone needs to study those, because we're going to need perhaps fewer software developers, perhaps fewer data scientists and analysts. But that's because everyone's going to need those capabilities. Think about Microsoft Excel, right? How many of us use Microsoft Excel on a regular basis, even if we're not data heads like me or Carlo, to be able to, kind of just look at charts and make data-driven arguments and the like. Before there was Microsoft Excel, there were just a few specialists who could use data. Now everyone uses data. And so we're going to see some of the same kind of thing. We're finding, in fact, that there's going to be a new set of power skills in an AI era. It was fascinating. We tried to figure out what skills. We try to like intermediate this debate between which skills are getting automated and which get augmented away, or which get automated away and which get augmented rather. And what we found was actually some of the same skills top both of our models. At first, like we looked at that and said, okay, well, we really screwed that up. And then when we dug in deeper, what we realized is that there are skills that make you more efficient and more effective. And every student needs to make sure that they have the opportunity to acquire those skills.
I see Bruno coming back on here. I think we could have used another 3 hours for this discussion, but thank you all so much. Bruno, please take over.
Thanks. Okay, I was looking at the Q&A, and maybe I'll throw out one question that cut across a few questions. I know Carrie picked up on several themes that were part of the Q&A. Practical instruments to help young people assess their skills. Judy talked about this a little bit, about something that's being developed, but does anyone have any suggestions about what might be available now that someone can use with a young person, a high school age person, to do some sort of skill assessment? And then we'll do that quickly and we'll close out here.
I know many products, including products like Cooter, who offers 14 or 15 states a navigation solution, have a RIASEC-based assessment. I'm not so sure if it's exactly a skill assessment, but it basically is a snapshot of where the young person is at that time and then points them to sort of what their next step would be. So if I took a RIASEC, it might say, oh, you should be looking in the marketing area, which is surprisingly true because I am. And when I did the RIASEC, it was true. So I think there's things like RIASECs. I know schools use them as well. I don't know, Matt and Carlo, if you know of others.
The only other thing I would suggest is, first of all, I would say I'm so excited, Judy, for what you're building because I think there is such a need. But I'll also say there's a really low-tech way to do this as well. And that's to sit down with a student and open up Indeed and look at job ads together and say, okay, if this is a career you want to go into, what are you going to need to know? And that's important both in terms of identifying the requirements, but also in starting to accustom students to language. What's the language they're going to need to speak in order to convince employers that they're worth sitting down for interview?
Terrific on those two very practical suggestions. Let's close out here. Today's webinar was co-sponsored by the 74 and the Progressive Policy Institute project on reinventing America's schools and its project on new skills for a new economy. I want to thank our guests here, Carrie, Matt, Carlo, and Judy for their time. And thanks everyone for listening in. Obviously, this will be posted to the 74 website as well as the PPI one. And we thank you all very much for your time today. Good day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruno.